everyone. Welcome to another episode of the DVD Graveyard. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at Friday the 13th from 1980. Or I should say, finally taking a look at Friday the 13th, because this is one that I've been putting off for quite some time. But I figured, what better time than this year, because we're getting this first Friday the 13th here in in February. We're getting the second one in March, and then we're getting a third one in, I think, November is when the third one is. So I plan to knock out as many of these as I can. This year I figured what better time to do it. And like I said, this is one that I've been waiting to talk about for a long time, because this is, without a doubt, hands down, out of all your big name slasher franchises, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all these big franchises that we all know and love. This is, without a doubt, Friday the 13th is my favorite. Now, it hasn't always been my favorite. I used to go back and forth on Halloween and Friday the 13th a lot. When I was younger, it would be Halloween for a little while, and then I would move back over to Friday the 13th, and then back to Halloween, and so on and so forth. But, the older I've gotten, this has really become just the mainstay franchise for me. Because, whereas with Halloween, for example, that's another, big franchise for me. It's really only those first two movies for me that I love. Halloween 1 and 2, I love to death. And some of the sequels I love, for nostalgic reasons mainly. But for the most part, with the sequels to Halloween, they're kind of take it or leave it for the most part. And I'll kind of discuss that a little bit more, whenever I talk about those films. But with Friday the 13th, I found that I can go back and watch any one of these films. It doesn't matter. I mean, the good, the bad, the ugly, it doesn't matter. And I can enjoy them. I can put any of them on and get a sense of enjoyment. Now, of course, there are some that I like more than others, but overall, this franchise, even though it's probably the most poorly done as far as story writing and its canon and all that good stuff goes, it's just my favorite. I mean, there's something about Friday the 13th that I love. And from the first entry, which we're going to talk about today, all the way up into the latest entry, which I'm counting as Friday the 13th, 2009, because I did, that we have gotten Sweet Revenge in 2025, which was a glorified trailer for Angry Orchard's Hard Cider. And that I did not really care for. I did a review on that, and you can hear what I have to say about that, but didn't really care for that one. So in my mind, I'm still considering it, 1 through the remake. And I know that there's talks of a lot more Friday the 13th stuff to come, and I'm just not really excited about that. I wish we could get one solid, good remake movie, from somewhere. And I mean, it may be good, it may not be. The way that things are shaping up, it seems like it's not, whatever it is, it's not going to be very good. So in the meantime, what we're going to do here at the DVD Graveyard is we're just going to show our appreciation for the classic run of Friday the 13th movies, like I said, all the way up until the remake, and we will cover anything else as it comes out, if we so choose. So this film was directed by Sean S. Cunningham, who previously had worked on Last House on the Left with Wes Craven, and that was kind of his other sort of horror thing. And he sort of saw the success of Halloween. He saw how well Halloween was doing, and he basically wanted to rip it off, pretty much, and I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily, because there was a lot of people who wanted to kind of do that at that point. But what's even funnier is once he made this film, a lot of people started to kind of, wanting to rip off Friday the 13th. So, and I think that personally, I think Friday the 13th got a little bit larger in scale than Halloween did in various ways. But I think that it kind of outshined, Halloween in a way, in my eyes anyway. And like I said, earlier, this being my favorite franchise, I don't know if it's due to nostalgia, because I did grow up with both Halloween and Friday the 13th and all those other franchises being a kind of a mainstay in my life. But I just have this really fond memory of Friday the 13th. When I was, I couldn't even tell you. I was very young. Blockbuster was still around, and Blockbuster still had VHS. If that puts a date on this, so it was a while back. It was in that kind of middle area when we still had VHS everywhere, and we still and DVD was starting to kind of come out. So it was in that kind of middle range, and I was very young. And I remember we would go to Blockbuster every weekend as a family, and my dad, my mom, and my sister, we would all rent movies. My mom and dad would rent a movie for them. My sister would rent a movie, and I would rent a movie. And I just remember going. I would always just beeline to the horror section because horror was always really big in my house. My parents were big horror fans, so I've always been around horror. And I remember hearing about Friday the 13th, but I'd never seen them. It was one of those things where I'd always heard about Jason and Camp Crystal Lake and all this other stuff, but I'd never seen the films. And so when I would go to the horror section, they had all the Friday the 13th except for they didn't have the first one, and I don't think that they had the second one. I think they only had 3 through whatever the most current one was at that point in time, probably. But I just remember every weekend when we would go, because this was a regular thing, we would go and I would just stare at all these covers. I love the VHS covers even to this day. And I remember renting part 3 and taking it home with me. And I guess I'd seen Freddy vs. Jason at this time too. I guess Freddy vs. Jason was out at this point. It must have been brand new. So 2003, 2002, 2003, somewhere around in there. Because I remember taking part 3 home, and I was enamored with it. I mean, I just fell in love with this franchise. And then, of course, I watched it over and over and over. And I remember we took that one back. I rented Final Chapter, and then I rented A New Beginning, and then I rented, Jason Lives, and just went down the cycle until I finished all of them. So this just became like a personal project for me to watch all of the Friday the 13th films. And it's just a really fond memory I have. But like I said, Friday the 13th 1 and 2 were ones that I couldn't ever really get my hands on until a few years later, when I really started collecting DVDs, or maybe it was my parents that got them. I can't remember. But I finally got my hands on the first film and the second one. I saw part 2 first, and then I went and saw the first one, and I already knew the twist and everything. And I won't lie, the first time I watched the first Friday the 13th, I didn't really care for it too much. I think that's a lot of people's kind of feeling of this film is, especially if you saw it kind of the way I did, if you went kind of backwards. I found it kind of boring and kind of slow, but again, I was really young. But the older I've gotten and the more I go back to this movie, I love it. I mean, the atmosphere, the kills, the gore that you get, the setting at the camp. I grew up going to the lake quite a bit, so and then going camping with my dad out in the woods at our deer lease that we had. So it really kind of, had this kind of, what's the word for it? It really kind of felt homey to me in a way. And so, like I said, it wasn't until years later when I finally saw the first Friday the 13th, or I'm sorry, now that I've gotten older and I've watched it again, talking about the first Friday the 13th, I just have fallen in love with it, and I just kind of want to show my appreciation for this film. So what I'm going to do here is, again, this isn't going to be like really a full-on review, because I mean everybody has talked about Friday the 13th at this point. So I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the things I love about this movie and some of the things that I guess don't really work in this movie necessarily. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So I do have the Scream Factory Friday the 13th box set. I got my hands on one of those just a couple of years ago, and I'm so glad I have that. That is absolutely, without a doubt, my favorite box set out of my entire collection. I do also have the Crystal Lake to Manhattan box set, which I actually watched that more than I actually watched the Scream Factory box set, to tell you the truth. I don't know why. There's just something about that box set that I really love. And then, of course, I have all the single DVDs all the way up to Friday the 13th, 2009. So this one I have here in my hand is just the basic kind of Paramount DVD from the widescreen collection. And I got this one just because this is the first copy I bought, many, many years ago once I had actually started collecting DVDs and stuff. And I have this one, the second one, and I think the third one is also one of those Paramount kind of widescreen releases, and maybe Final Chapter as well. But I have all these first line of DVDs. So just holding this in my hand is very nostalgic for me because I remember just getting this for the first time and just being so excited to take it home and watch it. So I'm going to read the plot synopsis on the back of this now. So, terror and suspense abound in this 24-hour nightmare of blood. Camp Crystal Lake has been shuttered for over 20 years due to several vicious and unsolved murders. The camp's new owner and several young counselors are readying the property for a reopening, despite warnings of a death curse by local residents. The curse proves true on Friday the 13th, as one by one, each of the counselors is stalked by a violent killer. This film is widely acclaimed for its horrifying and creative murder sequences. So that is the good little way to kind of sum this movie up. So this movie, when it came out in 1980, again, like I said, it was kind of made off this, based off kind of the success of Halloween, how successful that film was. And I can't really imagine what it must have been like when this movie came out in 1980, because you didn't really have anything like this at the time. So, you had films, of course, like, you had Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, which, arguably to some is like the first sort of incarnation of a slasher film. The way that I always see it is that, you got Texas Chainsaw, you got Black Christmas, and that was kind of the blueprints that the house that Halloween was built on. Well, the way that I see it is again, those two films were the blueprints. Halloween was kind of the frame, of the house, and then Friday the 13th put the walls up, because Friday the 13th really kind of took it, to the extreme, because whereas those other films I just mentioned previously, they were not very violent and they were not very gory. I mean, the kind of concepts of the films were quite disturbing, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It felt a lot more violent and disturbing than what it actually was. Same thing with, like Halloween, but at the, those were more of a practice in suspense, whereas Friday the 13th kind of took that, but it was like, let's throw the gore in there too, let's add the gore to this. And that's really, I think, kind of what pushed this over the top. And ever since then, Friday the 13th has been censored so heavily, especially part 7, which we'll talk about that when we get to it. So if you get the chance to watch this movie, you have got to watch the uncut version. This DVD is not the uncut version, but definitely watch that version. That is the superior version. But to be honest with you, even watching just the theatrical cut, which is this one, it's really not too bad. There's not too hard of cuts in this. Again, not anything compared to part 7, what they would cut down in that. But this one, definitely the cuts are kind of mine. Like, I can live with the cuts, like if I'm just kind of putting this on casually. But if I want to watch the definitive version, I will absolutely watch the unrated cut. And speaking of the gore effects, the gore effects are done so well because Tom Savini, the main man, the household name at this point, who had worked on Dawn of the Dead previously to this, he was in charge of all the gore effects. And of course, Tom Savini is just a master at all of this stuff, and he made it look so great. We get some excellent kills in this movie, from the arrow in the throat, to the axe to the face, just some excellent gore effects. And honestly, this movie is remembered as being very, very gory, but by today's standards, of course, it's really not. You can look back on this and it's not over the top gory compared to something like Terrifier, like we get nowadays, or like Hatchet, which is really, really brutal and over the top. But for the time, I imagine that this must have blown people's minds. This film has a pretty, I don't want to say a huge cast, a lot of very, unknown people. So of course we get Kevin Bacon in his debut role in this film as Jack, Adrienne King, who plays Alice, who would be our final girl in this film. which we don't really know that. I'll touch more on that in just a minute. We had Robbie Morgan, who played Annie, who is the first girl to be murdered in a Friday the 13th film. Well, you could say that loosely because there are two more kills at the beginning of this movie. Laurie Bartram, who plays Brenda, Janine Taylor, who plays Marcy, and then, of course, Walt Gorney, who plays Crazy Ralph, Peter Brewer, who plays Steve Christie, and then Ari Lehman is in this film, who plays Jason. So I was about to say something else, but I will save that for later. So anyway, like I said, fairly unknown cast. Oh, I almost forgot the number one of all. Betsy Palmer is in this film, and Betsy Palmer is just great. Again, we'll talk more about her in just a little bit. So, like the plot synopsis says, this film basically follows a group of teenagers who want to reopen this summer camp, Camp Crystal Lake, after it has been closed down for several years, and they are there for a couple of weeks before they actually get any kids in, and they're just kind of working around the camp, and they are kind of picked off one by one until we kind of get to our climax with our final girl, Alice. And like I said just a little bit ago, starting out in this movie, we have a decent sized cast, but none of them, like, for example, when you watch Halloween, that Jamie Lee Curtis is our final girl. So we spend, kind of an equal amount of time with all these guys. We're not really just solely focusing on Alice, again, like in Halloween, where we focus a lot more on Jamie Lee Curtis's character. So it's kind of she's sort of a surprise final girl at the end. I really like that the cast really has kind of equal screen time, and they're not the greatest actors by any means, but they are believable. Like, you really feel like they're at this camp, they're having a good time, before any of the kids come. And Steve Christie is kind of the stern sort of the old guy of the bunch. I mean, he's not an old man by any means, but he's just kind of has that sort of older kind of mentality about him, where he's there to get shit done and the rest of them are there just to kind of screw around and get stoned and drink and hang out and stuff. And so good cast. I really like the cast of this film a lot. So like I said, this film is very atmospheric, and so that really picks up. Like, the beginning of this movie is just really fun. There's a lot of they're having a good time. They're swimming, but we know that there is a killer kind of lurking off screen watching them. And the atmosphere really kind of starts to come in at night. And this is one of those films that every time it's a dark, rainy, stormy night, this is one of the films that goes into my player, because it just has this atmosphere to it. The night sequences in this film are so cozy. I mean, this is just kind of a dream situation for me, is just to be at this campground on a stormy night, with my wife and, some of my friends, and have a cabin to ourselves and everything else. That's just such a kind of cozy feeling. And even though I said, like, whenever I was younger, I didn't really wasn't really crazy about this film, it was just, it had this feeling to it. It had this atmosphere to it that I just loved. And that was one thing that always kind of stuck with me. Now, having said that, the film is kind of slow. Like, it does take its time, and as people remember Friday the 13th as being really gory and kind of in your face at times, this film really was not like that. There's a lot of really slow parts in this film where you get, for example, I know there's a scene where Alice makes coffee and it shows the entire process of her making coffee. Or there's a part where, the scene of them playing Monopoly, they're playing strip Monopoly and just kind of hanging out in the in the cabin, so there is a lot of slow parts, but I think that really does add to the film. It kind of adds to the tension, because once this film really picks up, in the ending sequences, it really is kind of in your face, when you get to that final kind of kill sequence, or a chase sequence, I should say. So another thing about this film that I'll say is it's shot kind of like a giallo film a little bit. So, a lot of POV shots, very reminiscent of, like Black Christmas and Halloween. So we get a lot of that, and a lot of just kind of whenever we get the kill, it kind of fades to white. A hand coming in off screen kind of slits the girl's throat. So it's sort of a it reminds me very much of a Giallo film in that regard. But the thing I can say about this film, in that is Giallo are murder mysteries. So, the whole film we get all these kills and we don't know who it is. And then, of course, at the end, the killer is revealed. So we have a lot of red herrings in this film. Steve Christie, Crazy Ralph. You could even say that the cop that comes to kind of check out the camp before all this goes down, they're all sort of red herrings. If I hadn't known the twist beforehand, I would have actually thought it was Steve Christie, because of course he has the same Jeep that the killer is driving in the film. It's the exact same Jeep, just because they had a very low budget. So a lot of red herrings in this film. And I think the one mistake that this film kind of made, in hindsight, that they could have done, is when the killer is revealed at the end. I should say, not even when the killer is revealed, when we meet the final character in this film, we know it's the killer. We know exactly what's going down. We know what's going on, because she wasn't with us the whole film. And that killer is, of course, everyone knows this twist by now, but it is Betsy Palmer, who is playing Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's mother. So that's one thing I wish they would have done earlier, is they would have introduced Betsy Palmer just a little bit earlier, because that way she would have just been another kind of red herring character. And then when it's revealed, it would be even more impactful. Like, oh shit, it was her. Like, even if they'd shown her just at the diner, or if she'd shown up at the camp to kind of visit with them, because we know that Steve Christie, knows her, because of one scene in particular, during his death scene. But that's one thing that I think that this film could have done just a little bit differently. It doesn't really take away from it too much, but again, that's just something that I might have changed if I had done this film. Maybe when my multi-million-dollar franchise comes out, I can make those kind of decisions. But anyway, so speaking of Betsy Palmer, she did not want to do this movie. She was not into horror films by any means, which a lot of people weren't. Horror is nowadays horror is loved and beloved by many people, and has a lot of diehard kind of cult fans, especially with this film. Everybody knows Friday the 13th at this point. But back then, horror was kind of, it was dirty and gross, and it was not something that you really wanted to do. It would kind of put a stain on your career, how a lot of people thought. But, horror sells, and sex sells, which is another thing that this movie kind of played on. And so Betsy Palmer only did this film because she needed money to buy a car. And I remember there was an interview where she said that she read the script and said, what a piece of shit, but she ultimately decided to do it because it was going to pay her exactly what she needed to buy her car. And I'm so thankful that she did, because Betsy Palmer did such an excellent job in this film. She is amazing. So when we first meet her, she's very loving and caring, and just what is going on, child, what's wrong, and she's so sweet and sympathetic, and you really kind of feel like I would feel safe around her. But then once she loses her shit and she starts to kind of go into her little schizophrenic mode, or whatever you want to call it, where she's talking to Jason and mumbling to herself and chasing after Alice, she's scary. I mean, she is terrifying in this movie. She does such a great job. She really put her whole everything into this performance, and I'm so thankful that she did that. I mean, she is so great in this film. I think that maybe they could have cast someone different in this role, but I'm glad that they found Betsy Palmer, because she is just fantastic. She does such a great job. And when we meet her, like I said, we kind of get this final chase sequence, which is become, a mainstay in horror, and kind of always has been, for a long time. And so we get our final chase sequence of her chasing Alice, and they have a kind of a fight on the beach of the lake, and Alice beheads Mrs. Voorhees. And in the unrated cut, we really get to see the full thing with the headless body, and the blood kind of spurting out of the neck. Again, Tom Savini did such excellent special effects on this film. And then, of course, she dies, and Alice gets in a canoe and rows out into the lake and falls asleep. And then that brings us to one thing that I really think shot this movie up, even higher, was the ending of this film. So that is where, the next morning we get Alice floating through the lake. We get this gorgeous music playing. It's a bright and sunny day. The night is over. The rain is the storm has stopped. The police have shown up. They're on the bank of the lake, and so we feel safe. We feel that Alice has been saved, because that's usually what happens. And then, of course, she's not, because Jason, young boy Jason, pops out of the water, and he just looks better than he's ever looked. The young model for Jason just looks so great. He's all deformed and gross and covered in weeds and just pond muck and everything. He just looks so nasty, and grabs Alice and pulls her into the lake. And that idea came from, I believe, Tom Savini. I don't think that was in the script, but Tom Savini had just seen Carrie. And, if anybody's seen Carrie, the ending is kind of a jump scare. Very similar in this vein, where Carrie's hand kind of comes out of the grave and you don't really expect it. So they had seen that, so they were trying to kind of do something like that, and it worked. It was very successful. Alice is pulled down into the lake, and the camera moves down onto the lake, and we kind of fade out. And so before I should say this, if anybody ever tells you that Jason is not in this film, you can say, yes, he is. He is in this film, very briefly. Again, played by Ari Lehman. So he was the first Jason. I think he actually has a band or something called like First Jason, or I don't know. He really kind of leans on the fact that he was the first Jason. So I said that that's where the film ends. It is not. That is where the film should have ended. I really wish it would have just cut and went to credits right after that, because then Alice wakes up in the hospital. The sheriff is kind of talking to her about her experience, and she, says, the boy, is he dead too? And tells her, ma'am, we didn't find any boy. Then he's still there, still there, still there. And it kind of echoes off. And then, of course, we get the credits with the excellent Friday the 13th theme, which I forgot to mention earlier. The music is done by Harry Manfredini, who would do the music, from here on out, basically up until Jason Takes Manhattan. The music is so good in this film. It's excellent. I love the original Friday the 13th theme so much. It fits the environment and fits the whole kind of theme of the film so well. So that is it. That is the first Friday the 13th from 1980. And of course, this film blew up. It got, larger than life and spawned so many sequels. I think 11 sequels it spawned at this point, because Friday the 13th has yet to make it to a 13th film, surprisingly, if you don't count the fan films, of course, which I will touch on those another time. But this film, it spawned a lot of imitators, and I think that this is really where the slasher film sort of kind of took off into what we would know it as to come, later on. Because after this, of course, in the following years, we would get films like The Burning, which is such a damn good film. I'd love to talk about The Burning again. Sleepaway Camp, which Sleepaway Camp is also excellent. I love Sleepaway Camp. Madman is another one that kind of comes to mind, that kind of has this whole kind of camp aesthetic. Just Before Dawn, which I've talked about, a few months back last year sometime. I don't even remember when it was. So, a lot of very similar films, in that vein. So, and I always attribute that to Friday the 13th. I think Friday the 13th like I said earlier, took the foundation and everything that was laid down by the previous films, such as Texas Chainsaw, Black Christmas, and Halloween, and then sprinkled in some giallo elements, which I also have something to say about that whenever we get to Friday the 13th Part 2, about a Mario Bava film, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it. Hopefully I don't forget about it. But I think that this film really is what put the slasher film into what it is now, and what it would become later, of course. And this film, even to this day, is still revered. All the sequels are highly, loved by people. I think everybody knows who Jason Voorhees is now, and everybody knows what Friday the 13th is. but it all started here, humble beginnings with the first Friday the 13th from 1980. This is such an excellent film. Like I said, so atmospheric. It has just this excellent vibe to it. Great kills. It's a perfect little stormy, rainy night kind of movie, and it pairs really well with the second film. If you watch them back to back, I really love doing that. Hell, even the first three are a really nice kind of back to back watch, a triple feature, if you wanted to do that. But I love this movie. Like I said, I didn't care for it too much when I saw it when I was younger, but the more I watch it and the more I've seen it, I just absolutely love this film. I did a ranking of these movies, I think last year before last, and I think I put this one, I don't remember where I put this one, to be honest with you. I could probably redo that ranking all over again. It'd probably be completely different, but I'd probably put this movie a lot closer to the top than I did. Like I said, I don't really remember where I put it. I'd have to rewatch that. Maybe I'll do another ranking after this is all said and done and re-rank them and see if my opinions have changed. So anyway, that was Friday the 13th. Now, under my belt, I'm glad to check that one off the list. Stay tuned for the next video. I plan to cover more Friday the 13th films. And so, as always, have a great night and goodbye.